A sinister blob appears on the outskirts of a small town and begins to invade the homes of the inhabitants in the most varied ways possible in order to feed on the humans. Today we're going to recap the story of the movie, The Blob, from 1988. In a small town in California, Paul exchanges glances with one of the cheerleaders before returning to the field. In an attempt to impress Meg, the young man runs to get the ball, but ends up being knocked down by the opposing team's players. Seeing Paul on the floor, the young woman approaches him to check that he is all right, and the young man takes the opportunity to ask her out. A few days after leaving reform school, Brian has a motorcycle accident while trying to cross a broken bridge and has to walk to Moss's workshop to borrow some tools to fix the vehicle. In return, Brian says he will help Moss in the workshop over the weekend and, after picking up the tools, he walks back into the forest. Meanwhile, a man who lives in the woods with his dog spots a fireball falling from the sky and narrowly misses being hit by it. When it falls to the ground, the sphere causes a great deal of damage, and the old man decides to walk into the hole to find out what it is that fell from the sky. With the help of a branch, he takes a sample of the gelatinous substance found inside the comet, but ends up hurting himself when the goo touches his skin. That evening, Paul goes to Meg's house and, after ringing the doorbell, is greeted by Mrs. Penny, the girl's mother, who invites him in. At that moment, Kevin, Meg's younger brother, informs her that he's going to sleep at Eddie's house, but the truth is that they're going to the movies in hiding. Meanwhile, Brian is in the woods fixing his motorcycle when he begins to feel that he is being watched. Suddenly, the beggar appears and tries to use one of the tools to cut his hand, but the goo starts to run up his arms. At that moment, the man flees in desperation and ends up being run over by Paul, who was driving next to Meg. As the street is poorly lit, the young man couldn't see the man in time to brake the vehicle, but immediately got out of the car to help him up. When they realize that the man is very badly hurt, the couple decide to take him to the hospital, and Paul asks Brian to accompany him to help explain what has happened. When he gets there, Paul has to explain to the receptionist what happened, and the woman calls a nurse to take the old man to the waiting room. While the young man is filling in the medical form, Brian decides to leave. After filling out the form, Paul goes to check that the old man is all right and notices that he is squirming in bed. Frightened, the young man runs to get the doctor's help, and when the doctor removes the blanket, he realizes that the man's entire body has been eaten away by the goo that was stuck to his hand. Immediately, Brian runs to call the sheriff and has no idea that the walking jello is right behind him. While the young man is talking to Herb on the phone, the creature attacks him, and Meg hears the young man's screams. At this point, the young woman runs towards him and tries to pull him up, but Paul's arms end up coming loose and his body is completely corroded. After hitting her head on the wall, Meg collapses and is attended to by nurses. Minutes later, her parents are called to the hospital and take her home. When he arrives at the hospital, the sheriff orders his men to take what's left of Paul for analysis and promises himself that he will catch the criminal responsible for this scene of chaos. A few meters away from the hospital, Scott and Vicky are dating in the car, and the young man gets out to get the drink from the trunk. At this point, the young woman falls asleep in the backseat and doesn't see the goo approaching the vehicle. When he gets into the car, Scott realizes that his girlfriend has fallen asleep and tries to wake her up. However, at that moment, he ends up being attacked by the monstrous blob, which had already taken over Vicky's body. During the attack, the young man tries to escape, but ends up being eliminated. Realizing that her daughter is still in shock, Mrs. Penny goes to her room and gives Meg some medicine to help her sleep. While the police search for a culprit, the creature continues to grow stronger with each person it devours. A few hours later, Brian is taken to the police station on suspicion of a crime and is questioned by the sheriff. However, even after telling them everything he knows, the young man is not released, because Herb and Bill are convinced that he was involved in all those eliminations. Despite knowing that this young man is a problem, the police know that there is no evidence to incriminate him, so they decide to let him go. As he leaves the police station, Brian runs into Meg, and the young woman says that she went there to pay his bail because she knows the young man is innocent. At this point, she learns that Brian has already been released and says she needs to talk to him. However, the young man ignores her and crosses the street to go to a diner. Meg immediately goes after him and asks for his help in convincing the police that he is telling the truth about what happened in the hospital. After devouring Paul, the goo disappeared, so when she explained to her parents and the police what had happened, Meg was branded hysterical, as no one believed what she was saying. However, Brian says he can't help her because all he saw was the beggar with an unknown substance in his hand. While the young man is eating a sandwich, Meg claims that the thing that was in the old man's hand eliminated him and then finished Paul off. According to her, the creature is growing bigger and bigger and is now on the loose in the city. Upon hearing this, Brian makes fun of the girl and asks if she hasn't used any illicit substances lately. At this point, Meg becomes furious and gets up to leave, so Brian realizes that she is serious and tries to calm her down. After apologizing, he shares his sandwich with Meg and says he's there to listen to her vent. After serving dessert to the teenagers, Fran goes to the kitchen to wash up, as the cafeteria is about to close. Looking at the sink, the waitress realizes that the drain is clogged and uses a plunger to try to clear the water passage. When he realizes that the woman is having trouble, George offers to help her, but he can't unclog the sink either. So the man decides to stick his hand down the drain, at which point he makes his biggest mistake. Suddenly, the gelatinous creature pops out of the sink and pulls George's head into the drain. When Fran enters the kitchen, she sees her colleague's body being dragged into the sewer and starts screaming, so Brian and Meg rush over to see what's going on. At that moment, the young people are confronted with a frightening scene, as George's feet are sucked inside while the pipes burst, spreading a huge amount of blood everywhere. The goo then comes out of its hiding place and hangs from the ceiling in an attempt to catch new victims. Luckily, Brian and Meg manage to escape and hide in the utility room. Soon after, the monster appears and tries to get under the door, but soon gives up on catching the pair. Meanwhile, Fran breaks the window to escape and runs to the phone booth to ask the police for help. However, before the waitress could even complete the call, the walking jelly approached and tried to break into the booth. At that moment, Fran tries to block the doors and panics when she sees the faces of the victims floating inside that gelatinous body. Suddenly, the creature starts to crawl under the doors and breaks the glass to get into the cabin. Realizing that Meg is in shock, Brian hugs her and promises that he will get them out of there safely. Carefully, the young man opens the pantry door and walks slowly through the kitchen to make sure the enemy isn't around. That night, while walking alone through the streets, Reverend Meeker comes across the thing gliding towards him and begins to pray, realizing that the end is near. Surprisingly, instead of attacking him, the jelly hides in the sewer and the Reverend crosses the street to enter the diner where the monster came from. His aim is to find out if anyone is hurt inside, but all he finds is a black cat feeding in the utility room. However, the man realizes that there has been an attack there recently, as everything around is destroyed. While walking around the diner looking for possible victims, Meeker finds shiny stones lying on the floor and decides to take some of them for himself. Just then, Brian and Meg arrive at the police station and ask the secretary to call the sheriff. However, Sally reveals that she is unable to get in touch with any of the police team, as they have all gone to Ilkin Woods to look for clues to the possible suspect in eliminating all those people. According to Brian, it was there that he found the beggar who was attacked by the goo, so the pair decide to go there to warn the police about the danger they are in. When they get to the highway, the young people find a car running and decide to go into the woods in search of the sheriff. Suddenly, they come across police aircraft and are surrounded by a group of armed people dressed in white suits. Just then, Dr. Meadows approaches and orders all the security guards to put down their weapons. The man claims that he is part of a government-authorized biorestriction team and has gone to that town to help the citizens get rid of an alien threat. According to Meadows, that gooey creature that is devouring people arrived on Earth via a meteorite. Millions of years ago, dinosaurs ruled the planet and ended up becoming extinct in a short period of time. Evidence indicates that this happened because countless meteors containing an alien bacterium fell to Earth and wiped out those animals. Due to recent events, the government believes that the same thing has happened now, so Meadows and his team have been sent to start the prevention protocol. One night, a couple are camping in the woods and kissing around a fireplace when Lance is startled by the sound of a chainsaw. Looking around, he sees a man pruning some bushes and begins to wonder why he is doing this at that time of night. Suddenly, the man raises his head and Lance realizes that he is wearing a mask. At that moment, Eddie and Kevin get excited, because the most awaited moment of the movie is coming. Although this film is very macabre and forbidden to minors, the pair managed to get into the cinema thanks to Anthony, Eddie's cousin, who works at the box office. Meanwhile, backstage, Hobbs realizes that the air conditioning in his office has stopped working and tries to fix it. To do this, he has to remove the grating and calls the technician for help to unclog the pipes. While his friend doesn't arrive to help him, Hobbs decides to start an investigation to find out what caused the air conditioning to stop working. But as soon as he sticks his head into the pipe, the monster attacks him and he doesn't even have time to get away. Minutes later, when Hargis appears in the room, he notices that all the lights are off and, when he looks up, he finds Hobbs' body completely deformed and stuck to the ceiling. Seeing this terrifying scene, the man is paralyzed with fear and can't run away, so he ends up becoming another victim of the monster goo. After telling Dr. Meadows everything they know about the thing, Brian and Meg are taken to a van and forced to return to Arborville, because the scientist claims that the whole town is in isolation. Once the unknown organism has been isolated, all residents must undergo an evaluation to ensure that there is no contamination. However, during the journey, Brian tries to open the van door and says that they need to get out of town. When she hears this, Meg feels confused, as she is convinced that the scientists have gone there to help them, but the young man doesn't believe in the government's good intentions. After opening the door, Brian calls Meg to run away with him, but the young woman decides to return to the city to find her family. So Brian decides to drive off on his own and jumps onto the road. Minutes later, Meg arrives in town and finds a crowd gathered around the town hall. When she finds her parents, the girl is relieved, but discovers that her brother is at the movies with Eddie and decides to go after him. At that moment, the bizarre blob is attached to the ceiling of the room and captures a guy who was sitting in the armchair behind Kevin. Seeing the man being attacked, the young man starts screaming, attracting the attention of everyone around. When they look up at the ceiling, everyone realizes the presence of the creature and flees in desperation. Hearing the screams, Meg realizes that her brother is in danger and enters the cinema to rescue him. In the midst of all the chaos, the young woman sees the young man trying to escape through the emergency exit, but the door is locked. So the trio decide to escape down the stairs, but Kevin's jacket ends up getting stuck in the door and his sister tries to help him free himself. During their escape, they come to an end and have to flee through the sewer. At this point, the monster uses its tentacles to try and capture them and pulls Meg's hair, but the young girl manages to get free and escapes through the tunnels with the boys. After picking up his motorcycle, Brian tries to sneak out of town when he comes across a group of government officials saying that all the roads are closed and the phones have been cut off. In an attempt to find out what they are up to, the young man decides to follow them and discovers that it was Dr. Meadows himself who created that bacterium years ago and sent it into space via a satellite. According to him, over all these years out of orbit, the microorganism has developed into a plastic life that hunts its prey. While listening to Meadows' conversation with his team, Brian discovers that the bacterium was created to be used as a biological weapon by the American nation against the Russians. However, now that it is growing rampantly, the creature poses a major threat to the country and, if not contained, will put the lives of all US citizens at risk. When he discovers Dr. Meadows' true intentions with regard to the inhabitants of Arborville, Jennings says he doesn't agree with the experiment because their lives will be in danger. Just then, the colonel receives a call from one of his subordinates and Anthony reveals that his cousin Eddie and 2 other people need to be rescued from the sewer, as they are on the run from the creature. Upon hearing this, Meadows decides to trap the organism in the sewer so that they can study it during the hunt and is willing to sacrifice civilians to continue with his experiment. While snooping around, Brian ends up being caught in the act by one of the soldiers and decides to attack him to avoid being arrested. After taking down the guard, the young man runs off and Meadows orders his team to go after him. Immediately, Brian gets on his motorcycle and flees through the forest, but is almost hit by gunfire. Just then, he spots the broken bridge and speeds up his vehicle to try and cross it. This time, the young man manages to complete his objective and decides to go after Meg in the sewer. Meanwhile, the young woman is looking for a way out of there and is trying to calm the boys down, as they are both afraid to be eaten alive. Suddenly, one of the sewer rats is eaten and the trio realize that the blob is getting closer. Immediately, Meg helps the young men onto a pipe, but Eddie ends up being dragged into the water. Without thinking twice, the young woman dives in after him, but finds only the young man's body. Terrified, she runs away and helps her brother climb over the pipes to reach a small manhole. However, she can't get through the opening and orders Kevin to run to City Hall and ask for help. She then jumps back into the water and tries to climb a ramp, but ends up slipping and is saved by Brian, who pulls her out. At this point, they both get on his bike and try to escape, but end up getting stuck in a tunnel with no way out and have to go back. When he realizes that he is surrounded by the monster gelatin, Brian decides to do a maneuver and manages to get through the tunnel without touching the goo. However, he ends up slipping in the water and, after the fall, his motorcycle stops working. So the couple decide to flee on foot and come across Baker, one of the soldiers who has been sent to eliminate Brian. The man tells them that the thing has devoured his colleagues and, when he sees the creature approaching, he shows it the way out of the sewer. However, when he spots Brian inside, Meadows orders his team to close the manhole with the excuse that they need to contain the blob and, once again, the youngsters are left to be eliminated. Immediately, Brian climbs the ladder to try to lift the lid, but the doctor orders the driver to use the van's wheel to obstruct the passage. Suddenly, the water starts to rise and Brian grabs Baker's cannon to blow off the manhole cover. During the attack, the van is destroyed and all the townspeople hear the noise. The trio then climbs the stairs and manages to reach the surface and, After helping Meg out of the manhole, Brian grabs a gun to defend himself. At this point, Meadows says that the young man is contaminated and asks his men to shoot him, but Bill orders everyone to put down their weapons. In an attempt to prove that the doctor is lying, Brian reveals all of the scientist's plans and tells him that the gelatinous creature is the result of an experiment that he and his team are conducting with the government. When he realizes that he is being unmasked in public, Meadows takes the gun from one of the soldiers and prepares to shoot Brian, but is interrupted by the arrival of the monster. Through the manhole opening, the creature captures its creator and drags him into the sewer while eating away at his body. Then the colonel and his men get together to destroy that blob and drop a bomb into the sewer. After the explosion, the soldiers come to the conclusion that the thing has been destroyed, but the truth is that the attack only served to make it even angrier. Suddenly, the monster comes out of the manhole and attacks everyone it meets along the way. Seeing the blob approaching, soldiers and civilians alike try to escape, but many of them end up being captured along the way. At that moment, the Reverend approaches and says that Doomsday has finally arrived. In an attempt to contain the threat, some scientists use a flamethrower to attack it, but the fire ends up turning against them and even Reverend Meeker is affected by the flames. Meg immediately grabs a fire extinguisher to help her and attacks the alien with a blast of cold air. At this point, the young woman realizes that the thing can't stand the cold and uses this weakness to try to drive it away. Thanks to Meg, the survivors manage to hide in the town hall and block all the doors so that the creature can't follow them. While the citizens unite to fight the enemy, Brian goes to get a snow machine and drives to the town hall, trying to use some furniture to hold the door closed. Bill ends up being captured and has his torso broken in half as he is dragged into the blob's gelatinous body. When Brian approaches, the monster decides to attack the snow truck and throws the reservoir away. Seeing Brian in danger, Meg immediately goes to help her friend who is trapped inside the vehicle and takes the gun from one of the soldiers to try and eliminate the beast. Her plan is to attract the blob's attention so that Brian has time to free himself, so she takes it to the ice tank. The young woman then activates a detonator near the tank and runs back to the town hall. At that moment, a huge explosion occurs and the snow causes the creature to be destroyed. With the destruction of the monster, countless stones are scattered throughout the city. Weeks after surviving the apocalypse, Reverend Meeker gains a legion of believers and claims that the reckoning will come soon. What no one imagines is that the precious stones the man found in the cafeteria have been transformed into a new organism that he intends to release as soon as he receives a divine sign. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.